Hey everybody, I'm out in this snowy morning to talk to you a little bit more about ISO. ISO, if I remember right, stands for International Standard of Organization. I guess the camera manufacturers decided to use that back in the day. I don't know the history behind it, but what it is in essence the sensitivity of your sensor, your CCD sensor on your camera. I talked about this on my previous video, I'll put right up here, but I want to go into more depth today. ISO is very similar to turning the volume up on an electric guitar. So the higher the volume goes, the more distortion you're going to get. And it's the same basic concept on a digital camera. The higher you put the ISO, the more noise or distortion you're going to get. I really want to go into detail today about why you would use higher ISOs and how to use automatic ISO on your camera, which is what I do when I'm shooting wildlife with that lens and other lenses. So let's talk more about ISO. So when you're shooting in manual on your camera, you've got the metering system in your camera. As you change the f-stop, the meter changes. As you change the shutter speed, the meter changes. So if you change the ISO, let's change it high, notice how much the meter changed. There's a fox right over there. Shall we photograph him? So this park where I'm photographing these fox, they roam all over, but they stay on the other side of this fence on this private property for the most part because there's a fence separating them from people. And more than that, people come and feed them all the time. So it's not really cool to feed wildlife. These are wild animals. And if you're coming and feeding them, you're really contributing to their overpopulation, because there's not as much food source in here as you would think to support as many fox as there are. I just was photographing 3 different fox, and when somebody comes in and starts throwing food, 15, 20 fox will show up. So it's really not good to feed wildlife, but this is a great opportunity to come photograph them. I've got another park down here closer to my home that there's fox in that people don't feed, and they're wary. They won't let you get within 100 yards usually unless you're sneaky and then they run off. These guys will come right up to the fence, expecting handouts. So I don't condone feeding wild animals and baiting them to get them to come in so you can get photographs of them. That's why I'm clarifying this. It's just a nice place to come shoot this video, and I knew I could get some photographs of some fox. So let's talk more about ISO. As I was saying, as you change the ISO, the meter will change. So let's put it down to 64. See there at 64 how underexposed it is, and bringing it up to 320 puts the exposure right where I want it, to be shooting at 1/500th of a second at f7. I'm shooting 1/500th of a second of these fox to make sure I get good steady images even though I'm on a tripod, and at f7 the aperture's wide open enough that the background is going to be fairly blurry, which helps make the fox stand out more. So ISO is extremely important on getting a good exposure. A good exposure is made up of 3 components: the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture of your lens. There are many cases where you might need to use a higher ISO, like when it's darker outside, you've got to let more light in so you can get a properly exposed image. Photographing the night sky is a classic example of using a high ISO. I commonly shoot my night sky photographs at ISO 6400 the f-stop or aperture wide open at 2.8 on my lens, and usually between 15 and 30 second exposures. Just depends on what I'm trying to get. So now let's talk about why you would set your camera on auto ISO. You use auto ISO specifically when you're photographing wildlife. It helps so much. Set it on auto ISO, then pick whatever shutter speed and aperture combination you want, and the camera will automatically change the ISO to make sure you're getting a proper exposure. There are times you have to make the exposure brighter than you would think. Snow is a great example. One of the things I like to do when photographing in snow is overexposing my image by about 2 stops. You do that by spot metering on the snow and then bumping it up by 2 stops. When you're shooting in auto ISO to accomplish that, you need to change the exposure compensation on your camera, because if you got auto ISO on, it's just going to change the ISO up to get a good average exposure, depending on what your meter is set on, obviously. So using the exposure compensation by bumping it up 1.5, 2 stops will help the images be brighter and more properly exposed when shooting in the snow, whether you're on auto ISO or not. Let me show you that. On my camera, the Nikon D850, there's a button right up here that you can press, and then by changing the wheel here, you can change the exposure compensation. So there's 1 stop and there's 2 stops. To access auto ISO on my camera, I have to go into menu and then go over to camera and then scroll down and find ISO sensitivity, go into that, go to auto ISO and turn it on. It's not just a simple quick switch to do it on my camera. All right, hold on just a second there. That other guy has no clue what he's talking about. On a Nikon D850, you can hold down the ISO button right there while rotating this dial right there and change the auto ISO from on to off. It's that simple. So now my display is blinking auto ISO. It's set it at 1000 to get a good exposure here. I have the exposure compensation set at +2, and the fox have come back. Notice on the auto ISO out there, it's set it at 1250. When I point my camera over here into the trees, the auto ISO jumps it up to 5000. So watch it move as I pan across. It's changing the ISO just depending on where the meter is pointing. Your camera also has multimetering functions, generally spot meter, matrix, something similar to matrix, and center weight, which the way that all works is a whole nother lesson, but setting your meter appropriately can really help get a better exposure. And when your meter is set, like mine is set right now on just on matrix, where it takes the whole scene into account and then averages it out, that will change how the exposure is going to happen, especially if you're running on auto ISO. So check what your metering is. Another thing is check your histogram frequently. I talk about this a lot, but let me show you this. Here's a shot I got of a fox with its nose down in the snow, and there's my histogram. It's overexposed. It's way over to the right. I wanted it to be overexposed so the fox would be properly exposed. Sometimes you just have to sacrifice the highlights when you're photographing, especially wildlife. You got to just overexpose stuff to get the subject to look right. It's just the way it is. If it's underexposed, the darks of the eyes get too black, or like if you're photographing a duck and it's, you know, like a coot or something, and it's got a lot of dark on it, then that dark will be really underexposed and you won't be able to see the detail in it. So sacrificing the highlights a little bit is okay if you have to do it. So understanding ISO is extremely important if you want to learn to take better photographs, especially when shooting in manual mode. It's just a must. You don't always have to shoot in manual mode, as I said. You can put it in auto ISO. There are other applications of shooting in automatic mode. For instance, the A setting on your camera, which is aperture priority, the S setting, which is shutter priority, and the P setting, which is full on program, or if something similar to that. But I always shoot in manual, except for when I put it in auto ISO to get better photographs. You really need to control what's going on when you're taking your photographs to get what you want. So I hope you enjoy this little episode explaining ISO a little bit better, and seeing some of these cute little fox. Thanks for watching. Happy trails.